So welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director. Welcome to our monthly program screening and discussing a labor history film. Tonight's film is The River Ran Red, a documentary film made in the early 90s about the Great Homestead Steel Strike in the early 1890s. And our special guest this evening is John Hinshaw. I'm very proud John was a student of mine at Macalester in the late 80s. And John has been teaching at Lebanon Valley College in central Pennsylvania for some time, and is also the author of this great book, Steel and Steelworkers, which is on our shelves here at the Eastside Freedom Library. So John did his graduate work with our friend Joe Trotter at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And while he was there and for some time thereafter was involved in efforts to create an appropriate memorialization of the Homestead Steel Strike, which is why I wanted to talk to him about this film. So, John, you want to tell us a little more about your research into steelworkers and what that has to do with the Homestead Strike?
Sure. So I came to Pittsburgh basically from the Middle West. I grew up on a cattle farm, so this was not my lived experience. But when I lived in Pittsburgh, when I came, it was 1987. The Homestead Works had just been closed permanently by U.S. Steel. Most of the steel industry had been shut down in the previous 10 years, and along with all their kind of related or auxiliary industries. And so the region was just kind of in free fall and reeling. And so the Pittsburgh of today, which is all about research on, or software or robotics research or autonomous, self-driving cars, all of that was just a gleam in the city father's eyes. And it was eye-opening to live in a place where companies could just pick up and leave and upend everything. And so almost none of the guys who were steelworkers became programmers. I mean, so it's just this new economy rose up, but it has almost no connection to what came before. And so that's what led me to get really interested in this kind of example of labor organization and company organization, sort of the kind of dual histories of labor organization and corporate power.
And how did the reorganization of the steel industry in the 1890s set a stage for the Homestead Strike, the transformation in the way steel was being made then?
Sure. So the Homestead Strike is kind of the culmination of one era of labor organization and company organization and the start of another. So it's right at the dawn of corporate America and big monopolies like U.S. Steel. And it's at the end of this long period of craft unionism, which is a kind of a very, very different style of organization than most people are used to. I mean, the old steel industry, which was pretty small in scale, those guys who were the craft unionists were basically like contractors on a building site, right? They had their own crew, they hired them, they were the boss of that crew, and they were paid a percentage of the final product. So the owners, they were not employees, they were contractors. And they had rules through a union that were to some degree on themselves, and then usually were a kind of negotiation with the owners about what percentage of the final product they would get. At this price of steel or iron, they would get so much, and so on and so forth. So that all made a kind of sense, because unions in the United States have never been able to rely on the courts. They've always been in this bizarre limbo where they are a form of monopoly. And of course, we're against monopolies. Monopolies are bad. Companies can set up monopolies for some strange reason, but so craft unions were able to exercise power because they didn't have to go on strike. they could force employers to kind of bend to their will a little bit. Because if you didn't have a guy to make iron and you didn't know how to make iron, you were out of luck. You would go out of business, right? And so these craft unions survived but in the context of the post-Civil War world where steel is under great demand and there's a lot of technological change, those old small-scale unions start banding together. You form an amalgamated union, as you'll see in the documentary, and they hang on for another generation, but then they just run into a really major problem, which is that they have this kind of solidarity that's based in the workplace, that's based in the community, but they're now up against companies that are so big and so rich and so powerful, they can hire private armies, they can basically put the governor in their pocket, all the newspapers and the mass media of their day in their pocket. And Pennsylvania was such a corrupt state, and it still is in many ways, that until the 1950s, there were 2 seats on the floor of the state Senate that were reserved for, I think it was, one was for Mellon Bank and then the other was for one of the railroads. And that was because they didn't want to have to, the senators didn't want to have to traipse into the lobby to talk to those guys because they were going to give them their marching orders. So it was just much more convenient all the way around if they sat in on the legislation. They wouldn't vote, but of course they could decide what was read out. So in that context, these old style unions really had a major problem, which is they were trying to hang on. And so that's what you're going to see in this story, is that local solidarity, this intense ability to organize people who aren't even part of the union to basically stand up to these, to the corporations of their day. They just get taken out by less by the Pinkertons than ultimately by the governor of Pennsylvania. And then that sets up the next 45 years where companies just run roughshod over everybody. And they're able to have private police forces on the company that have machine guns. They keep a list of whoever is a red or whoever they think is an agitator. They have the local police in their pocket. They have this kind of influence at the state level. And so everybody, including the amalgamated, is still trying to organize steelworkers, right? The amalgamated has another strike, and 10 years later, you know, they hang on. The IWW comes to town in 1909 and they organize a big strike. There's socialist parties and, you know, unions affiliated with the Socialist Party. There's, in the 1920s, you get Communist Party unions. Everybody in the world is trying to organize these guys, but they keep running into the same problems, which is if you can't talk to anybody, you can't organize at work. And if you can't talk to people in the community because there's spies and, you know, around, then you can't organize there. If you organize a strike, you're going to get your head broken. And this kind of system of policing gets more and more sophisticated, including and up to the state police, who basically take over where the National Guard leaves off. And they are like an elite cavalry unit first, that are based in the eastern and western sides of the state, that are kind of police, coal workers, and steel workers. And then later, by happenstance, they get into things like, oh yeah, and then we could do traffic. But primarily, that's their role. So by the time you get to the 30s, where steelworkers become an industrial union, it happens in an interesting way, which is that John L. Lewis comes out of the coal industry, organizes a much more chaotic and less monopolized sector. So he organizes workers and employers, and then has a kind of political movement to take over the state. And they get the first and the second Democratic governor in 80 years, who basically says to the steel companies, you have to allow these workers to be able to at least vote on having a union. And that's what allows Johns and Laughlin in Pittsburgh to organize. And then later they leverage that political clout with Roosevelt at the national level. And that's what they do, this weird thing where they get the Navy won't buy steel from companies that don't essentially adhere to a labor standard. And that's, so that's what gets you sort of from this craft unionism, which had its day and was very influential, to the steelworkers, which basically then ran things and were extremely powerful for 40 years and still exist. And in the companies that they work for, they're hanging on and making sure that their members get representation and benefits and all the rest. But Homestead is that kind of hinge point between these two different points in time. So it's a fascinating, important story.
Yeah. So anyway. I want to make one point and then ask another question. And the point is that it would be irresponsible of me sitting in a Carnegie Library building not to mention that the steel company in Homestead, the U.S. Steel Works, was owned by Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie, who would become the funder of libraries, made super profits off the exploitation of workers and breaking unions of workers in order to accumulate the wealth that made him a philanthropist. So we always like to recognize Mr. Carnegie's place in this kind of history.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character. I mean, he's the first, by our standards, he's the first billionaire. Nobody had ever had as much cash as he had when he sold the Carnegie, his company. It was, hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, multiples of what J.P. Morgan ended up with. I mean, he had 20 or 30 times as much cash as J.P. Morgan ever had. So it's, I mean, crazy amounts of wealth. Jeff Bezos kind of.
Right, is the parallel today. Yeah.
Sure.
So let's go back for a second to this transition that you're talking about from the craft unionism and the amalgamating of different craft unions together and their largely unsuccessful efforts to hang on and then the development of industrial unions in the 30s. And can we talk a little bit about the demographics of who the workers are
Sure.
and how that changes over this period as well? So racially and ethnically, who are the workers in 1892? Who becomes the workforce that organizes finally successfully with this political strategy that you also described by the New Deal in the 30s?
So the demographics change. In the 19th century, you largely have a kind of old stock Protestant workforce. I mean, they're the guys who have the time and the timing to get into those skilled trades. By the time you get to the 1890s, you do have just most of the then as now immigrants are great for a kind of the unskilled or the kind of heavy lifting and heavy industry, because their frames of reference aren't, that, oh, these are long hours and this is low pay. Their frames of reference are, well, compared to being a peasant farmer in Slovakia, or not even in Slovakia, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this is less work. And this is, at least I'm being paid cash. And so at that time, it's probably like about a third native worker and then 2/3 unskilled. And then you do have skilled African-American workers in places like the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia. And they're largely blocked from the industry in the North. And the strike is, the 1892 strike is how you get African-Americans brought in as strike breakers. And then they remain a kind of, they remain employed, not in terribly large numbers. You're talking like 5 to 10%. But part of the reason their presence is to remind the workers that they can be replaced, and in part. And by the time you get to like 1910s, 1920s, the industry, there still are these old stock Protestants around, but they're smaller in number. They tend to end up being in the skilled trades. They run a lot of the stuff in the mill. They're at the kind of top of at least the blue collar pecking order, and even in the managers. And then so it's probably like 25% old stock, Protestants, 60% immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and then, and it depends a lot on the mill, 15 to 20% African Americans. And then I wrote a whole book on all the kind of politics on which job people had and which industries people had. Yeah, this book. And the story I remember is that and I'm blanking on his name, but it was an immigrant who later ended up going into the Communist Party. And he was like, so almost everybody's first job was working on a blast furnace, or you're like shoveling. It's very dusty, very hot, very grueling work. And he's like, and the older guys would say, don't worry, it's like a trial. So you work there for a few weeks, and then they'll bring you into a cleaner, better paid, less dangerous job. And they're like, well, this guy says he's been on this job 20 years. Why has he been here? No, he's a black. That's the first thing you got to learn in America is these guys never get a fair shake. So that's what the steelworkers in the 30s, they have to try to unwind some of that. And it's, and it's uneven by the time you get to the period. I mean, African Americans don't exactly get full access to all the jobs. On the other hand, they are the strongest advocates for the union, because without the union, they would have gotten even less. And so it's a fascinating set of politics. But.
Yeah. So we don't have much time left.
Sure.
Let me fast forward to, again, your arrival in Pittsburgh in 1987, and the Homestead Steel Works is closing. I remember at the time of the Hormel strike in 85 and 86 that we got to know some of the union leaders from Steelworkers 1397 in Homestead, Ronnie Weeson, Darrell Becker, people with the Monongahela Valley Coalition, who lost the fight to try to keep the plant open. I feel like, while I was not directly involved, that after that, there was a fight to keep the memory of the strike and the memory of the union and the memory of the struggles, to keep that memory alive. And I believe that kind of sets a context for how this movie we're going to see tonight came to be made. What can you say about the efforts to keep the memory of this history alive in Homestead?
That's a great question. I think the struggle to kind of memorialize and reframe history and make it available to the present generation is, I think, what every generation does. There's not, Ron Weeson, it wasn't like his great-grandfather fought in the strike and that's why he learned it. He read something about it and then he kind of said, oh, because we're having this issue with the company, these are the same bastards, and that's the language he would have used. It's the same bastards that we were there when they shot us down in the streets of Homestead in 1892. And so he used that understanding of the past to mobilize people in the present. And the same is true with the groups that really fought a kind of long struggle to kind of remember Pittsburgh as a labor town and the area as a labor town. In some ways, what I would say to the people watching the documentary and that you're participating with is that even though you don't have some sort of DNA connection to that strike, you know about it and you get to kind of make sense out of it for today's world. And it's just part, and that's how it's always been, I think, is people, the tendency of Americans to forget the past or to kind of go with the default moment, that everything's good, that, hey, the companies are really looking out for us, that this is the only way it could be, right. That things like Homestead come along and you can say, nah, people don't always take that, but it takes a tremendous amount of work to either organize people. And I get more and more, I have more and more admiration for how much work it took then and takes now to get people to do anything together. And then to kind of keep that memory going for another generation. Those are both kind of go hand in hand. So you need a union, you need a movement, you need a library, you need people to kind of help bring it all together. So we're in that proud tradition of kind of making sense of labor history and then trying to bring that into our lives around for the movements of today.
That's a great lead into the film. Thank you, John. I want to mention before we start the film that we'll be having another conversation with John on Tuesday evening, October 20th. We'll be reading a paper of his on Puerto Rican immigration to central Pennsylvania and the creation of an identity that he calls Dutch-Rican. And I think it gives us a lot to think about with immigrants from Central America and East Africa working in the meatpacking industry in smaller communities spread around Minnesota. So keep your eye out, get in touch, send us an email at info@eastsidefreedomlibrary.org and we'll send you John's paper. And we'll be seeing him again on October 20th. Thank you, John, for taking the time to frame this film tonight. Stay tuned, everybody. Enjoy. Thank you.
From all your waters, America, I choose the river with the magical name, Monongahela. For the river has a tale to tell, even deeper and longer than it is. Over homesteads, humpbacked houses, there remains still the pall of gun smoke, writing the story of the awaited massacre. The sooty smokestacks of Carnegie will not cover the writing of the gunsmoke, as long as the Monongahela River tells this story to its banks.
At the beginning of 1892, the people of Homestead, Pennsylvania, had no idea of the upheaval that was about to transform their lives. They had built a proud and prosperous community upriver from Pittsburgh. In just 10 years, 12,000 men, women, and children had settled around the Carnegie Steel Works. They were setting records in the production of armor plate and structural steel, and transforming America in the process.
The past and present are known, and the record fills every homesteader with pride. What of the future? It is full of promise. Flanked by the greatest industrial city of the Union, with splendid railroad and water facilities, having the most extensive and varied steel mills in the country, the future growth of Homestead will undoubtedly be more rapid than its past, and before another decade, it will be the largest town in western Pennsylvania.
By the end of 1892, Homestead would be known throughout the world, but not for the reasons its boosters had hoped. A fierce conflict would erupt that summer, pitting the country's most powerful labor union against its largest steelmaker. The workers' right to organize hung in the balance. The outcome would shape their lives for generations to come. In the wake of the Civil War, an industrial revolution swept across America. Manufacturing flourished, and daring entrepreneurs became rich, very rich. But for the average factory worker, the revolution meant endless drudgery, long hours, and dangerous work.
April 2nd, 1892. The history of the Homestead Steel Works is marked with a large number of frightful accidents. That of last Saturday, wherein one man lost his life and 7 others received serious injuries, was scarcely less terrible. Molten metal came in contact with moisture, resulting in a terrific explosion, some of it striking the opposite wall 70 feet away.
Where machines were present, death and injury were commonplace. A single slip could cost a man his life. A widow was lucky if the company picked up the cost of the funeral. Children worked, some falling victim to indifferent machines. Even 3-year-olds sometimes spent 12-hour shifts at their mother's sides. Sooty streets, open sewers, and foul air were the trademarks of many factory towns. Workers often depended on the company for housing and owed their pay to company-run stores. Homestead was radically different. Work in the mill was just as hazardous, but steelworkers had built a powerful union which gave them a say in hiring, wages, and how jobs were done. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers had 800 members in Homestead, all skilled craftsmen. Workers' organizations, not the company, dominated civic life. Many homesteaders owned their own houses. Their taxes were bringing lights and sidewalks to city streets. Decent pay allowed their children to attend school, and reasonable hours in the mill left them time to run the local government.
The Constitution of this country guarantees all men the right to live. But in order to live, we must keep up a continuous struggle.
Homestead's elected leader was a union man, John McLucky. He had been active in labor politics since his days as a Pennsylvania coal miner. He believed that every working man should be able to feed and house his family. McLucky could be counted on to stick to his principles. He got his first job in steel in nearby Braddock. His employer was Andrew Carnegie, the man he would face in a bitter confrontation in 1892. Carnegie was a poor weaver's son when he left his native Scotland in 1848. By the 1880s, he had become one of America's leading industrialists. He was among the first iron manufacturers in the country to invest in steel. A stronger and more flexible metal than iron, steel proved highly profitable. It was rapidly replacing iron in railroad, bridge, and skyscraper construction, and revolutionary new technologies made it easier to produce. The iron industry relied on highly skilled, unionized craftsmen. Far fewer skilled men were needed to make steel. This left the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers vulnerable and opened the way for steel manufacturers to seize control of the shop floor. In mill after mill, workers fought back, but few succeeded. When the original owners of the Homestead Mill tried to impose a non-union contract in 1882, Homestead's workers accused them of instituting a new form of slavery.
To the editors, National Labor Tribune. Just think of it, fellow workmen, living in a land where not 20 years ago we had a war against slavery, in a land where freedom and independence was proclaimed, that we would go on in our right minds and sober senses and sign away our rights as free-born American citizens.
The message of the Homestead workers resonated up and down the Monongahela River Valley, and Homestead won its fight to remain a union mill. A year later, Andrew Carnegie purchased the Homestead Works and became America's biggest steel producer. With his working-class roots and his public statements on the rights of labor, Carnegie seemed just the man to oversee Homestead's workforce.
The right of the working man to combine and to form trades unions is no less sacred than the right of the manufacturer to enter into associations and conferences with his fellows, and it must sooner or later be conceded.
Carnegie made a commitment to use his wealth to improve the lives of his workers. He built libraries, schools, and concert halls, costing huge sums of money. To acquire this wealth, Carnegie increasingly focused on the bottom line. He began by eliminating most of his industrial competition. Then he drove the unions out of his mills. When unionized workers refused to yield, he hired armed guards to bring in non-union replacements. Homestead alone withstood Carnegie's assaults. In 1889, its powerful union forced the company to negotiate a 3-year contract after thousands of homesteaders confronted county deputies trying to bring non-union workers into town. As the end of that contract approached in 1892, Carnegie was determined to assert his rights and gain absolute control over the mill. From his home in New York City, he drafted a notice to the Homestead workers.
There has been forced upon this firm the question whether its works are to be run union or non-union. As the vast majority of our employees are non-union, the firm has decided that the minority must give way to the majority. These works, therefore, will be necessarily non-union after the expiration of the present agreement.
Carnegie sent the notice to the company's officers in Pittsburgh, but they never showed it to the Homestead workers. Instead, they urged Carnegie to take his annual vacation in Scotland and leave the matter to the company chairman, Henry Clay Frick. Frick was a brilliant entrepreneur. He made his fortune by buying up the region's best coal fields and by building over 1,000 ovens that turned coal into coke, an essential fuel for making steel. The Carnegie Company was Frick's biggest client, and in 1882 they negotiated a substantial interest in each other's firms. Frick was an uncompromising foe of organized labor, determined to increase profits. Carnegie chose him to run the new concern.
Frick had smashed the unions in his coke ovens at Connellsville, and some people said he meant to do a similar job in Homestead. While negotiations were still ostensibly in progress, Frick had a tall fence built around the mill and erected searchlight platforms around the mill yard. The union men promptly nicknamed the mill Fort Frick. A group of carpenters working on the fence heard a rougher call to one of them. "Do a good job on that fence, Charlie." The carpenter replied, "Ain't it a hell of a note? Like asking a man to dig his own grave."
The great convention of the Amalgamated Association opens today. It is beyond question the most powerful independent labor organization in the world, and every movement of the manufacturers seems to aim at its destruction in the coming conflict.
Homestead's unionized workers were given an ultimatum. Sign the company's contract by June 24th, or work in the mill on a non-union basis.
The eyes of the whole world of labor are at present fixed on Homestead. You are entering on a struggle for your rights. If you succeed, the labor of this great country will profit by your success. If you fail, success on their part will be all the harder to gain.
John McLucky took the floor.
The reduction of wages proposed by Mr. Frick means that we will receive from 12 to 42% less. This would mean a cessation of public improvements in Homestead, a material reduction of the prosperity of the town, and in a great many cases, individual hardship. We are asking nothing but our rights, and we will have them if it requires force to get them.
On June 24th, negotiations deadlocked. The following day, Frick wrote a letter to Robert Pinkerton, head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
We will want 300 guards for service at our Homestead mills as a measure of precaution against interference with our plan to start the operation of the works again on July 6, 1892.
The Pinkerton Agency was the most effective strike-breaking force in the country. By 1892, Pinkertons had used spies and armed guards to end over 70 labor disputes. So flagrant was their disregard for human life that 11 states had outlawed their employment. Working people feared and despised them. On June 28th, the Carnegie Company shut down the open hearth furnace and the armor plate mill, locking out 800 men. The next morning, the Amalgamated called a mass meeting. Most of the 3,000 who attended were not skilled workers. They didn't belong to the union, but all agreed to stand firm with the locked-out men. Soon, they would have little choice. During the meeting, the company shut the mill down, laying off the entire workforce. Within days, 600 of the foreign-born workers formed their own lodge of the Amalgamated. By 1892, Homestead had become home to an international working class. The expanding mill drew Slovaks, Poles, and other Eastern Europeans, just as it had their British, Irish, and German co-workers. Despite the anti-immigrant sentiments which prevailed in Western Pennsylvania, skilled and unskilled, union and non-union, native and foreign-born workers cast their lot together to succeed or fail as one. The Amalgamated appointed an advisory committee to direct the workmen's actions during the lockout. For their spokesman, they chose a charismatic young leader, Hugh O'Donnell.
The committee has decided to organize their forces on a truly military basis. We will be in touch with every city and hamlet in the United States, and will hear the moment a train of men for the mill leaves other cities.
Newspaper reporters and sketch artists converged on Homestead to see if the nation's largest steelmaker and its most militant labor union would come to blows.
The locked-out men are on picket duty at every possible point of entrance to the works. The country is thoroughly picketed and patrolled for 4 miles in every direction. No stranger is allowed to remain in town until his credentials have been proved satisfactory.
We do not propose that Andrew Carnegie's representatives shall bulldoze us. We have our homes in this town, our churches, our societies, and our cemeteries. We are bound to Homestead by all the ties that men hold dearest and most sacred. The Carnegie Company has imported men of all nationalities in places that are east of us, and west of us, and south of us. They never have imported a man into Homestead, and by God, they never will.
A suppressed volcano exists among the American workmen. And someday, there will be an uprising that will become history.
The Reverend J.J. McIllier was Homestead's Methodist minister.
The question is often asked, where would Homestead be without the mills? Why not ask, where would Andrew Carnegie be without the millions he has made from the mills? Capitalists should remember that men do not sell their self-respect when they sell their labor.
Even Ivy Leaguers absorbed in the weekend's Yale-Harvard race followed the events with increasing alarm. 1892 was a presidential election year, and Homestead posed a threat to the incumbent Republican Party. The Republican platform centered around a high tariff policy, supported by both business and labor. If the dispute at Homestead could not be settled to the workers' satisfaction, the party risked losing labor's vote.
July 2nd to the New York Times. The Carnegie Steel Company gave formal notice today that the Homestead Mill is to be operated as a non-union plant. The secretary said, any of our old employees may return to work, but they must make application as individuals. All who do not apply will be considered not to desire work, and their places will be filled by new men.
On the 4th of July, Frick sent a coded cable to Carnegie regarding plunge, their code word for Homestead.
Small pond, pony, plunge, repairing pond, pony, choke, watchman, arrive, plunge, morning, board, early.
The following day, Frick sent a message to the Allegheny County Jail. He asked the sheriff to send 100 deputies to Homestead to secure the mill for non-union workers. The sheriff feared this would cost him workers' votes. But Pittsburgh's political bosses pressured him to do Frick's bidding. He responded half-heartedly, leaving for Homestead with only 12 men. When the deputies arrived, the town appeared calm and the mill undamaged. The Amalgamated volunteered men to be sworn in as deputies, arguing that the union had a strong interest in protecting the mill. The sheriff refused, knowing this was not what Frick had in mind. Under the circumstances, the advisory committee refused to be held responsible for the mill and formally disbanded. As the committee destroyed its records, the sheriff and his men retreated to Pittsburgh. Within hours, Frick would press ahead with his secret plan for the 6th of July. At 10 o'clock that night, Pinkerton guards from New York and Chicago boarded trains for Ohio. They continued to the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where they boarded barges bound for Homestead. 50 of the 300 men were Pinkerton regulars. Only the officers knew what lay ahead. At 2 a.m., men standing watch downriver spotted the barges as they entered the locks. One man set off on horseback to warn the townspeople, while the others telegraphed ahead.
Homestead, Pennsylvania, July 6, 1892. Like the trumpet of judgment blew the steam whistle of the electric light works. It was the signal for battle, murder, and sudden death. Not one of the thousands who heard and leaped from their beds to answer its signal dreamed of how much blood was to flow in response to its call. There was no method, no leadership apparent. It was the uprising of a population. Not men alone, but women too. Women armed with clubs as they joined the throng which streamed up the tracks, picking its way with a light-footedness born of long practice over the ties. The leader of the women, a white-haired old beldam who had seen 40 strikes in her long life, strode to the front and brandished the hand billy which she always keeps about her house for just such emergencies. Clear as a bell, far above the roar of the angry crowd, came the voice of Hugh O'Donnell as, hatless and coatless, he tried to check the angry men.
In God's name, my good fellows, keep back! Don't press down and force them to do murder!
But the crowd surged forward. Frick's wooden fortress crumbled like paper, and hundreds rushed onto the mill site to confront the Pinkertons at the company landing. A steelworker's son, Billy Foy, walked brazenly toward the tugboat. Standing on deck was the Pinkerton captain, Frederick Hinde.
Now, men, we are coming ashore to guard these works, and we want to come without bloodshed. There are 300 men behind me, and you cannot stop us.
Come on! And if you come, you'll come over my carcass!
No one knows who fired first. One bullet struck Billy Foy, another Captain Hinde.
Then for the first time, the slouched hats took a hand. A row of rifles gleamed an instant from the side of the shoreward vessel, and in an instant more, a sheet of flame ran all along her clumsy hulk from stem to stern. Bad marksmanship has saved 100 lives here today.
Even so, the first volley proved deadly. 2 Pinkertons and 3 steelworkers lay mortally wounded. Dozens more were injured. O'Donnell escaped with only minor injury. A bullet grazed his thumb. But the first shots dashed his hopes of making peace. The show of force from the barges had released years of pent-up rage. Women and children were forced from the mill site, and the men prepared for battle. O'Donnell and the other strike leaders retreated to Amalgamated headquarters. With their captain down, the Pinkertons panicked. Despite the lull in the fighting, they made no move to seize the mill site. Instead, they placed Hinde and the other wounded guards on the tugboat Little Bill to be taken to a hospital in Braddock.
By the time that the Little Bill was underway for Braddock, the mill yard was a series of rifle pits. The bridge trestles and girders and heaps of scrap iron and half-open doors of the various mills and shops were filled with men skilled in the use of arms and bearing them in their hands. Not one of them, from the smooth-faced boys who seemed to prevail in numbers to huge, mustached old steelworkers who had drawn Carnegie's pay for half their lives, had any more compunction about killing a Pinkerton than they had about stamping on a mill rat. The sun rose gloriously, and from a distance the day was serene and quiet as a Sunday. Jack Morris stood up at the pumping station and looked out the window. A moment later, a Pinkerton ball pierced his forehead and he fell headlong out of the window, and 40 feet below, his bones were broken on the shore.
Morris's companions carried him home to his widow. The sight of his shattered body sparked cries for revenge. Seeing the impossibility of controlling the situation, Sheriff McCleary wired Governor Pattison requesting assistance from the state militia. Workers' votes had been crucial to Pattison's election, and he declined to intervene. By mid-morning, the strikers had witnessed so much blood, they were determined to make the Pinkertons pay. They fired an old Civil War cannon, then poured burning oil on the river, hoping to ignite the barges. The Pinkertons knew they couldn't hold out much longer.
We were penned in like rats. 4 times we put up a flag of truce, and 4 times it was shot away. And then we're crazy with fright, crying like babies. Those in charge were the worst of the lot.
A tall, brawny workman waved 2 sticks of dynamite high above his head. Men of Homestead and fellow strikers, our brothers have been shot down before our eyes by hired thugs. Yonder in these boats are hundreds of men who have murdered our friends and would ravish our homes. Not one must escape alive. As he spoke, he flourished the dynamite. A score of men raised their clubs and followed him. They were not savages. They were good, strong men, wrought up by the sight of blood and ready to take the lives of those who threatened them and theirs.
At last, the amalgamated leaders returned to the battle site. O'Donnell urged the reluctant crowd to accept a Pinkerton surrender. They agreed, but only on the condition that the guards be turned over to the sheriff and charged with murder.
It was a relief to us when we saw a man coming down the banks holding up his hands to us. He told us that we had better give in, and we agreed with him. As soon as it was announced that we would surrender, the strikers came down upon us. They took our money, our traveling bags, and our watches, and then clubbed us. We were driven ashore on the march to the town with something horrible. We were clubbed at every step. Sticks, stones, and dirt were thrown at us. The women pulled us down, spat in our faces, kicked us, and tore our clothing off while the crowd jeered and cheered. Our dead and wounded were carried on litters, and they were maltreated as well as the rest of us. I don't know how we ever managed to climb that hill and get into the jail, but it was a relief when we finally reached there. More dead than alive.
After a decade of Pinkerton victories, ordinary people had finally evened the score. But 10 men lay dying, and the outcome of the strike was as uncertain as ever.
The forces of the 19th century are capital and labor. United, they transform the desert into a garden. In collision, they convert the garden into a waste.
There was no celebrating in Homestead the day after the battle. Everyone expected more Pinkertons to arrive. McLucky closed the saloons, and the townspeople remained armed and vigilant as they buried their dead. The slain men were laid to rest on the hill above town. Most of the laborers were placed in unmarked graves. Jack Morris had been a member of the International Order of Oddfellows. He was buried in the Society's plot. Reverend McIllier gave the eulogy.
This town has been bathed in blood and tears, and it was all brought on by that one man, Carnegie's manager. He was the only man with little enough blood to do it. There is no more sensibility in that man than there is in a toad. Of what use can combinations of capital and trust be without the broad shoulders and horny hands of the toilers? These are the bone and sinew of the land. These are they that make its wealth and give it its prosperity.
The county coroner's office listed another 6 workmen dead as a result of the battle. The last to die was George Rutter, a Civil War veteran and a long-time Union activist. At 46 years old, he had already outlived most of the steelworkers of his generation. There were 3 confirmed Pinkerton deaths, but the papers reported that a 4th man committed suicide as a result of his experiences on the 6th of July. The remaining guards escaped the Union's plan to have them charged with murder. The sheriff gave in to political pressure and put them on an eastbound train in the early morning hours of July 7th. Henry Clay Frick was conspicuously absent from the battle site. He remained in his office smoking cigars and refused to meet with the Amalgamated's president, who was ready to concede almost anything to stop the fighting. When Carnegie learned of the battle, he wired Frick from Scotland.
All anxiety gone since you stand firm. Never employ one of these rioters. Let grass grow over the works.
The events at Homestead prompted Congress to hold hearings. The Pinkerton Agency was already under investigation for its role in suppressing strikes nationwide. As Congress convened its hearings on Homestead, Pinkertons were battling workers once again in the Idaho mining town of Coeur d'Alene. Anti-tariff Democrats lambasted corporations for using hired guns to settle their labor disputes. One senator asserted that large companies should be looked upon as public entities, with the owners' rights subject to the rights of their workers. The iron and steel industry was outraged.
The issue has developed not into a question of wages, but into the recognition of a principle, whether the owner of works has a right to manage them himself, subject to the law. There is no greater or more arrogant tyrant than organized labor when it is powerful enough to enforce its decrees.
Labor came out to champion the Homestead strikers. Workmen rallied in Chicago and New York, and hundreds of dollars in donations poured in. $4,500 workers at Carnegie's mills in Pittsburgh, Duquesne, and Beaver Falls struck in sympathy with the locked-out men. At the best restaurant in Homestead, the cook and waitresses refused to serve suspected strikebreakers. They walked off the job when the town became so crowded they could no longer tell who was who. Andrew Carnegie confined himself to the remote fishing lodge he had rented for $2,000 a week. When the press finally located him, he had little to say.
I must positively decline to enter into any discussion of the case. The news grieved me more than I can tell you. It came upon me like a thunderbolt in a clear sky.
In New York City, 2 Russian anarchists had been following the news from Homestead. Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman were certain that American workers were on the brink of revolution. They believed that violence was justified in the fight against exploitation. The events at Homestead were beckoning them to act on their beliefs. Just days after the battle, Berkman boarded a train for Pittsburgh. Goldman stayed behind.
His face bent low to mine, and he whispered, "Comrade, you will be with me to the last. You will proclaim that I gave what was dearest to me for an ideal, for the great, suffering people."
Berkman had only $15 in his pocket. Within the week, Goldman would wire him another $20 to purchase a new suit and a gun.
The country looks young and alluring in the early morning sunshine. But my thoughts are busy with Homestead. The removal of a tyrant is not merely justifiable, it is the highest duty of every revolutionist. Human life is indeed sacred and inviolate, but the killing of a tyrant, of an enemy of the people, is in no way to be considered as the taking of a life.
As Berkman's train sped toward Pittsburgh, an order flashed across the wires.
Put the division under arms and move at once, with ammunition, to the support of the Sheriff of Allegheny County at Homestead. Robert E. Patterson, Governor.
Pittsburgh's political bosses had been pressuring the governor. Given the sheriff's failure to gain control of the mill, Patterson agreed to call out the state militia. The amalgamated and the local government had continued to patrol the town and maintain order after the battle, even going so far as to repair Frick's fence. But they were not prepared for the arrival of troops.
You must show the world that you desire to maintain the peace, along with your rights. Welcome the soldiers. They are our friends.
Don't you believe it, man? They are coming here because that damn murderer Frick wants them. We have made the damn company rich, and now they send the soldiers here to shoot us down like the Pinkerton thugs have tried to.
There is a good deal of truth in what the brother before me said. I'm afraid it's bad to let them in. The blacklegs might be hiding in the rear. But then again, you can't stand up against them. They are not Pinkertons. And we can't fight the government of Pennsylvania.
The following morning, on July 12th, the entire community stood ready at the train station. They had prepared an elaborate welcome, hoping to convince the soldiers to defend their rights rather than the company's. Two hours later, General Snowden and 8,000 troops finally appeared, but not as expected. Avoiding the Homestead station, the soldiers debarked outside of town, marched in on foot, and immediately surrounded the mill. With the troops in town, the Carnegie Company was able to begin operations. Managers and clerks pitched in from the start. Bunkhouses and canteens were built for the new workforce. With few exceptions, former employees were not among the new hires.
Mr. Carnegie may be able to get non-union laborers, but without rollers, heaters, shearers, cutters, and other skilled workmen, the mills cannot start. And it is this class of men who will hold out to the last.
Contrary to O'Donnell's prediction, on July 15th, smoke could be seen rising from the Homestead mill for the first time since the lockout. Thanks to the mill's high degree of mechanization, the new unskilled workforce was producing steel. On July 23rd, Henry Clay Frick returned from lunch to finish off a routine day's work. Posing as an employment agent, Alexander Berkman had been trying to see him all morning. Outside Frick's office, the anarchist nervously paced the hall. By 2 o'clock, he could no longer stand the wait. He pushed his way into Frick's office and fired 2 shots.
Dead, I wonder? I must be sure. My eyes meet Frick's. His face is ashen gray. Blood is oozing from his neck. A strange feeling of shame comes over me. But the next moment I am filled with anger at this sentiment so unworthy of a revolutionist.
A crowd gathered as Berkman was restrained behind the second-story window. When the doctors arrived, Frick refused anesthesia in order to help them locate and remove the bullets. Then he signed some letters before leaving for home. The attempt on Frick's life shocked the nation. But the man himself remained unshaken.
I do not think I shall die. But whether I do or not, the company will pursue the same policy, and it will win.
3 cheers for the man who shot Frick!
Private W.L. Imes, a young militiaman stationed in Homestead, applauded Berkman's act. His commanding officer did not tolerate his candor. Imes was strung up by the thumbs until he lost consciousness, then drummed out of town with his head shaved. In a fashionable section of Pittsburgh, Frick lay in bed recovering from his wounds. Across the hall, Mrs. Frick lay convalescing as well. 2 days after the battle, she had given birth to a son. Neither mother nor child was well. Despite his doctor's orders to rest, Frick continued to attend to company business and to personally supervise the situation in Homestead. The Republican Party feared that the crisis would endanger President Harrison's re-election. They sent party regular John Milholland to meet with Frick.
Arriving in Pittsburgh, I learned that the Iron Master was in bed, still suffering severely from the effect of his wounds. Entirely courteous, Mr. Frick made it clear that even if Mr. Carnegie's consent was reinforced by the Cabinet, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, he, Frick, would not deviate 1 iota from the lines he had laid out to follow. His powerful jaws came together like a steel trap when he referred to the murderous exhibitions of the strikers. Yet, as he lay there, as white almost as the sheet itself, I realized that I was talking to a man of absolute nerve, with a will of iron, one who knew his own mind and indulged in no illusions as to the difficulties in the way of carrying out his purposes.
On August 3rd, Frick's newborn son died. A link between the battle and the infant's death formed in the public's mind. It brought sympathy to the grieving father, whose own life had been endangered. The Amalgamated denounced Berkman. Even before the assassination attempt, the Union had thrown several anarchists out of town for agitating among the strikers. Still, the public held the people of Homestead responsible for the shooting. O'Donnell feared the worst.
It would seem that the bullet from Berkman's pistol, failing in its foul intent, went straight through the heart of the Homestead Strike.
The strikers were also facing a legal assault. The company had had warrants issued for McLucky, O'Donnell, and 5 other men, charging them with the murders of 2 Pinkerton guards during the battle on July 6th. McLucky, who had worked hard to keep Homestead sober, surrendered at the courthouse in a state of drunken bravado. He was locked up, and bail was set at $10,000, severely straining the union's resources. By the end of October, 2,000 men were at work in the mill. 200 of them were former employees. In spite of continued support from across the nation, the unity of the forces at Homestead began to crumble. During the first week of November, many of the non-unionized mechanics deserted the Amalgamated. Winter was fast approaching, and a settlement seemed unlikely. Black workers, traditionally excluded from steelmaking at Homestead, were brought into the mill by company agents. Although they represented a small fraction of the non-union workforce, they were singled out for attack. Hundreds of townspeople vented their frustration in a vicious riot that ended with calls for lynching. On November 8th, Americans went to the polls and voted for the Democratic challenger, Grover Cleveland. As the Republicans had feared, President Harrison and his high tariff policy were defeated. On November 18th, Sylvester Critchlow became the first Homestead man to go to trial. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour before returning its verdict. Not guilty. But the strikers' vindication came too late. While Critchlow sat on trial, 2,000 mechanics and laborers proposed that the union call an end to the strike. At first, the union men balked at the thought of giving in. But after 2 days of dispirited debate, many were convinced that holding out would be futile. By a narrow margin, they voted to end the strike.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Strike declared off yesterday. Our victory is now complete and most gratifying.
Life worth living again. The first happy morning since July.
The following day, over 2,000 strikers lined up at the mill gate. Only 406 were rehired. The strike organizers were barred from working in the mill, and the company circulated a blacklist that kept them out of the industry nationwide. O'Donnell became a reporter and moved to Chicago. Alexander Berkman spent 14 years in prison before rejoining the anarchist movement. He and Emma Goldman were deported to Russia in 1919. McLuckie remained a political organizer, but his work was sporadic and poorly paid. He eventually settled in Mexico and took a job on the Sonora Railway. By the close of 1892, the Amalgamated had lost its jurisdiction in all the Carnegie mills. A decade later, the union had been driven from every major steel plant in the nation. Unionism in the steel industry had been crushed at Homestead. Before disbanding, the Homestead men issued this statement.
The most evident characteristic of our time and country is the control of each of our great national industries by one or a few men. It is a power which, though expressed as the right of employers to manage their business to suit themselves, is coming to mean nothing less than the right to manage the country to suit themselves.
In the year following the battle, 10 more states enacted laws banning the use of private armies. Businesses increasingly relied on state militias to quell their labor disputes. Long after his retirement, Frick continued to defend his role in the strike.
The demands of modern life called for such work as ours. And if we had not met the demands, others would have done so. Even without us, the steel industry of the country would have been just as great as it is, though men would have used other names in speaking of its leaders.
Homestead haunted Andrew Carnegie to the end of his days. He had built himself a reputation as a friend of the working man, but he could not wash his hands of the blood spilt on July 6th. He would return to Homestead in 1898 to present the town with a library. His employees, who worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, found little time to use it.
On the flats, close to the water's edge, there were masses of great sheds out of which grim smokestacks rose with a desolate effect. Higher up, the tenement houses stood in dingy rows, alternating with vacant lots. The sidewalks were sunken, swaying, full of holes. Everywhere the yellow mud of the street lay kneaded into a sticky mass, through which the groups of pale, lean men slouched in faded garments, grimy with the soot and grease of the mills.
This description of Homestead appeared less than 2 years after the strike. Another 4 decades would pass before the creation of industrial unions would substantially improve the lives of Homestead's workers.
But oh, it was awful that day at the homestead, when the river ran red on its way to the sea, when brave men were falling and women were weeping, and riot was king of the land of the free.